You must have heard of Pixar, a computer animation company located in Emeryville, California. I want to know the progression that Pixar has gone through to get to these high-quality feature-length films and shorts that we see today. I certainly do not know everything there is to know about Pixar's animation process, but I took a dive into some of the programs and methods they use to help them tackle such large and challenging projects. I may not be an animator, but I can definitely say without a doubt that it takes a crap ton of work. Starting off with that, let's get to it. Pixar starts with what we've been doing with our film projects. They make a storyboard. But unlike us, they do not have one person doing everything. They have story artists create rough drawings, then they pitch those ideas to the director and other story artists. The story artists act out the story as it's happening to take the people through the story one shot at a time. The writers then work with the artists and editors to put the drawings together into a reel, to get a feel for what the movie would look like and how frames would fit together. This reel would have a basic and foundational soundtrack accompanied by a scratch soundtrack and temporary dialogue. During this time, many changes are made, and they can go through 50,000 to 60,000 drawings per movie. After those initial sketches, we then go to concept art, which is done by the art department and production designers. The concept art is what we usually see when you're showing sketches of the characters. Their facial expressions, how they move, and this is usually used as a reference and just getting to know the character in general. This is followed closely behind by character design, which focuses on the characters' costumes and how that relates to the plot and setting. You then have color strips, which are digital illustrations that sort of look like paintings that are used by animators to get a feel of where things will be located. This can help figure out lighting and schemes and mood for each frame. Next is modeling. When using a computer, the modeling artists take basic shapes of the characters, sets, and props, then mold them into the desired shape. There's also rigging, which uses movable skeletons within the characters so animators can move them how they wish. Afterwards, there's shading and surfacing, which is when you add texture and lighting to characters in the setting. This helps them appear more realistic or achieve the theme the animators are going for. There is also creating the layout, which is when the characters are positioned in front of a virtual camera, and it helps the set dresser visualize where everything is, even if the background and setting is not completely filled out. When watching footage of how animators did this, it reminded me of when we used After Effects and digital media to do the 3D camera tracking. Animators also use references to help them animate. Shocker. This is done by observing the real world and putting the animators in the environment the characters are going through. For example, in Toy Story 3, when Buzz's mode got switched and he started doing the tango, the animators actually watched professional dancers do the dance and were able to replicate their movements. Also in Toy Story 3, when the toys were running through the trash to escape the incinerator, the animators actually created a contraption that replicated running through trash on a conveyor belt, just so that they would get that real experience. In general, for Pixar at least, it can take 8 weeks to create and visualize one shot, since a lot of this work is done by hand. To help animate characters, there is voicing, where the actors come in and act out their characters' lines. Just because they're not physically acting in the movie, doesn't mean they don't have to act using their facial expressions while recording. The actors' facial expressions can be helpful during the animation process, so animators can reference them when animating the character themselves. There's also simulation, which is used by computer programs to figure out movements and other aspects of the movie. Examples of this are weather and hair. This part is not done by hand, but it's more math and physics based. An example of this is Merida's hair, where it was super curly, but it also had this bouncy soft texture. Animators had to figure out how to make it look realistic. And of course, how could you forget about lighting, which is used to emphasize shots and set the tone of the scene. As we're in film class, I think we can all relate to using lighting to paint our shots. Humans are pretty complex in the real world, so one can imagine how hard it is to replicate that. When animating, at Pixar at least, they conquer the design of humans using multiple different programs. You have subdivision, which is where you're smoothing out surfaces. Imagine you have a square with 6 sides. You then give it more and more sides and corners, which makes it rounder. By doing this, you're gradually smoothing out its shape. For people, this was good, as if you had faces or bodies, they weren't blocks, but more smooth and round like an actual person. Another tool commonly used is PhysT, which stands for Physics Tool. This is used to help animate clothes separate from humans and can also help with hair. We see this with Sully from Monsters, Inc. and Violet from The Incredibles. Both were difficult to animate since Sully is covered with hair and Violet's long hair could not be done by hand. PhysT figures out how clothes or hair should move according to what the body does. PhysT is also used in Onward. The primary focus was on the dad, who had no upper body, and they had to figure out how the clothes would react when the lower half, his legs and pants, would move. There's also goo. Goo is used to get skin to react to moving and sliding muscles. This can be seen and was used in The Incredibles. This helps animators see how skin reacts with muscles in real time, and specifically helps animators with shoulders. You also have subsurface scattering. This is used to render skin, and it makes it look more translucent and lets light filter through it. A specific yet not obvious example of when this was used was in Finding Nemo, when it helped with light scattering on fish scales. You also have Taz, which helped with Merida's curly yet soft hair in Brave, Kingpin, which made Bones appear looser in Coco, and Mocap. This made background characters and people move more convincingly and realistic. Characters no longer had to be on a constant loop and could be on longer reels. This was evidently very helpful as animators no longer had to focus on background characters as much. You also have movement animation, which involves the rigging and modeling department. They first start with the character model in a neutral pose, then the character is rigged. This is similar to an inner skeleton of sorts. The animators play around with and use animated variables, also known as A-bars, and they use these to move different parts of the character. Specific examples of movement can be seen in Hank's tentacle rigging in Finding Dory, and Dante's tongue from Coco. Another important program is Gepetto, which then became Presto. It allowed animators to reuse and change rigs over different characters. This significantly sped up the animation process and gave animators more control over movements and facial expressions. Then there's also ground locking, which is more specific but still very helpful. Ground locking is used to set an object on a path without having to keyframe it frame by frame. In the movie Cars, this gave animators the freedom to put the cars on a set path and not have to worry about whether or not they would float off the road or go in a different direction. Later on, ground locking was actually used in Soul for these souls in the Great Beyond. So we've got humans, we've got movement. There's also clothes, which we don't really think about in our day-to-day life, but when animating, it can make all the difference. With clothes, you start with sketches and concept art. After that, the art references go to the character tailoring artist. They create 3D shapes with the clothes, where you have the model and then the character model, which is the skin. Animation work with cloth on Coco led to a lot of their progress on Onward. Here you also have surfacing, where shading artists add patterns, tints, and finishes to the clothes. They've also incorporated loom technology, which weaves the fabric of the clothes to make them look more realistic. There's also wrinkling, done between tailoring and shading artists customized for clothes depending on the situation and what the context calls for. Evidently, Pixar goes through a lot of work, and I didn't even cover a fraction of it. I'm very glad that I got to at least get a peek into how they construct these worlds. From my experience, at least, I think Pixar does a really good job of just taking you out of your own mind and out of this world and placing you in a completely different one. And it was very cool to see how they do it with just computers and a lot of hardworking and dedicated people.